Okay. So the final etiology that I want to mention is the lack of childhood infections and over-medicalisation. So Sun Si Miao talked about times in a young child's life where they pass through, they have a particularly rapid phase of growth and development, and he called them transformations and steamings. And during these times, the child often releases heat, so they can manifest as fevers, teething even, or quite serious febrile diseases. And as this quote implies, going through these phases actually changes the child. What he was saying is they're a really crucial part of development because they allow the child to release fecal toxins that they've brought into the world. So because most children are vaccinated and don't get many febrile diseases, and because even when a child gets a relatively mild fever or is a bit unhappy because they're teething, very often they're given Calpol or something immediately to bring the fever down, then it means it's hard for this heat to find a way out. And if it lingers in the body, then at adolescence, when there's an extra surge of yang, then this excess heat can rise up to the heart and cause agitation and mental, emotional problems. In another quote, Sun Si Miao also said, when these transformations and steamings are finished, the baby has become a human being, which I think is very interesting because he's implying that this somehow helps the child to become more kind of in the world, and to help the child's spirit to kind of incarnate into human form. So we can only speculate what this does to children when they're not allowed, as it were, to go through these transformations and steamings. But I think that's quite a major factor in the rise of adolescent mental health problems. So we're going to just briefly talk a little bit about the nature of adolescence, which I think of as the space in between. So the young person is no longer a child, but they're not yet an adult. In reality, they're often flipping from being a young child to being an adult, but they're going like this, or they're kind of paddling around in the space in between the two of them, not quite knowing who they are or what they are. So what does that feel like? Well, I hear teenagers say again and again and again things like, I don't know who I am anymore. One teenager, I wrote down the quote, they said, I used to know where everything was inside me, but now it feels like I'm a jumbled up jigsaw. So they sense that everything is changing, but it all feels very unfamiliar, and that can be very disconcerting. So, for example, it's right and normal that girls at the beginning of adolescence need to separate from their mothers. So one way that they do that is they start being, if any of you have girls, you'll know, being critical of their mothers and making kind of, comments about what they're wearing or that kind of thing. And they kind of recognise that they're doing it. They're suddenly being a bit mean to mummy, but they don't know why they're doing it, and that in itself can trouble them. And as I mentioned before, the qi at this changeover, this is essentially the second changeover of the 7 and 8 year cycles that we're talking about. The qi is very open. And when the qi is open, then the level of sensitivity to your environment increases. So again, if any of you have had or had teenagers, you'll know that you can be having kind of family banter that you've always had and maybe teasing them a little, and suddenly when they get to the age of 11 or 12 or 13, they become really offended and upset by something that you say that you might have said a million times before and it was all fine and they laughed, but there's that sensitivity that increases because of the opening of qi. And crucially, what drives the changes at adolescence is a massive increase in kidney yang. And that is what drives both the physical and the emotional changes. So childhood often, hopefully, feels like paddling down a nice, calm river. And adolescence often feels like being in the kind of the whitewater rapids. Or I think it can, if you're used to sort of driving a clapped out old banger, then at adolescence it's like you're suddenly put behind the wheels of a Porsche. And you have all this kind of extra energy and qi, but it's not yet integrated and you don't quite know what to do with it. So we'll see what effect that brings. So in health, this extra yang will be integrated gradually and it'll fuel all the changes that need to go on. But this doesn't always happen. And I'm going to talk about 3 key ways in which the qi can and often does become imbalanced at this time as a result of this surge of yang energy. So the first one is that qi becomes very constrained. So there's this wave, this surge of new power in the body, and if it doesn't have an expression, then it becomes constrained and held in. So if a child is expected to be perfect because that's the vibe of the family or the school or whatever, if they're never allowed to express their angry emotions, if they are generally not given enough freedom or don't find a way of expressing themselves, and if they don't move enough, then those will all add into the mix and increase the chances of this new qi leading to constraint. And instead of going kind of upwards and outwards, the qi implodes and sinks inwards and downwards. And as we all know, constraint of qi leads to depression. And the nature of the depression is often, what's the point? It's all hopeless, a kind of giving up, can't be bothered kind of depression. So the treatment is obviously to move the qi and start to release this constraint and get things moving again, to harmonize the shen and the hun. So the the hun needs to have movement, and obviously to see if there are any underlying deficiencies as well. So the kind of lifestyle advice that you might give to a young person whose qi is constrained is to try and help them find a release for their feelings of frustration. That might be taking up kickboxing, or it might be beating up a pillow, or it might be going for a run, or it might be writing. It could be anything. And to try and get them to move more and think less. They're very often stuck in their heads, and doing some physical activity not only moves the chi, but also encourages the chi back down into their body. And especially if a young person has a really overscheduled lifestyle, to try and look at how they can make time to wander and to wonder. So the hun needs to wander around, doesn't it? It shouldn't be all pent up and constrained and going from one thing to the next. And it's amazing how many young people just don't know how to just be at home. Some teenagers, if I ask them when they were younger if they kind of played imaginary games, they look at me as if I'm a bit mad. I think because so much play is technology based, or because they've had so many extra activities, they don't know how to just be at home and to give time for the hun to go into their imagination and into their fantasy world and find out what's there to help them connect with who they are and who they're becoming. And it's important to encourage authentic expression. So this isn't easy. I had one teenage girl who had this pattern, and she used to complain every time I saw her about certain things that her friends were doing that she got really upset about and actually really kind of angry about. And I encouraged her to actually find a way of talking to her friends about what she felt, what she found difficult, rather than just keeping it all inside. And these are the children who are more likely to be drawn towards alcohol and drugs, because it will temporarily release the constraint of chi. So I'm not suggesting you just say to them, don't drink and don't take drugs, but that has to be something that we need to bear in mind. So the second pattern that can arise when this surge, this wave of energy comes at adolescence, is that the shen becomes much more agitated, because the heat rises up, agitates the heart and the shen. So difficulties in friendships and relationships, either at home or at school, can increase the chances of this pattern. Too many head-based activities, so lots of studying and not enough of anything else. Excessive pressure, too much time on social media is a big one. And also a lack of emotional security. If things at home are not entirely happy, if the family situation is precarious and vulnerable, then it's going to be hard for the shen to feel rested and calm. So this pattern is really characterized by this upward movement of chi, which then agitates. So in order to treat it, we need to help the chi to descend, and also find points to calm the shen. And very often underlying this pattern is a deficiency of blood and or yin. And I find that blood deficiency, particularly in girls, very often appears for the first time around adolescence, just before they start menstruating, when the blood is diverted to the menstrual process, and there's not enough to then house the shen adequately. And obviously this is also a time when a lot of girls sadly start dieting, don't eat so well. Part of their teenage separation from their parents may be that they decide they're vegetarian, which means that they're less likely to get good blood nourishing foods. Yes, they are, yes. So for this young person, it's really important to try and work with them to find a balance between spending time with their family, spending time with their friends, and having time alone. Because the more agitated the Shen is, the more they need that contact with people to feel okay about themselves. So it becomes a bit of a vicious circle where they're driven to spend more time on social media, looking for someone to say something nice so that they feel okay about themselves, which temporarily settles their Shen, but obviously doesn't get to the root of it. Generally the Shen needs to be still and calm, so less stimulation in their lives is very important. So I treated a 13-year-old girl who was extremely anxious, and she came to me when her anxiety had tipped over into having panic attacks. And she'd always been quite an anxious girl, but at adolescence that became worse. She was anxious about school, about her friends, about everything really, and it took her a long time to get to sleep at night. And she was also a very bright girl, and I always used to choose 1 or 2 points in her head at the start of the treatment, like do 24 or do 20, gallbladder 13, and almost instantly you would see her chi just start to descend, and she would start to yawn, and I'd put in other points, and invariably she would fall asleep on the treatment couch. But you could almost see her chi just being stuck here and here, and it needed to go back down to kind of here and here.
Will you go over points with us?
Sorry?
Will you go over points?
I don't think I'm going to have time to go over points, unfortunately. But I would just say I don't have any point prescriptions. I would... I will talk about point categories actually, but I think that you have to choose points that resonate with the person in front of you.
Even you just saying that quickly, like do 24, do 20
is helpful. Okay,
so
when I can I'll pop points in. And then the third pathology that is common at adolescence is that this surge isn't strong enough. So the child approaches adolescence already depleted, and they haven't got the chi that it takes to get them kind of over this hill and to the other side. And these children are often both somewhat depressed and somewhat anxious. So they may be yang deficient, which leads them to feel a bit low and depressed, and they may be yin and blood deficient, which leads them to be somewhat anxious. So this may be a constitutional deficiency, but it may be that the child has been overscheduled from an early age. And I think I hear parents sometimes, when I try and talk to them about their child's schedule, saying things like, well, you know, her brother and sister have got the same schedule and they're fine with it. So I think being able to say to a parent, you know, I dare say that's the case, but this child has a different constitution to your other 2 children, and the reason that they're ill, the reason you're bringing them to see me is because they're not coping in some way, and therefore, you know, they need to have some more downtime. And obviously adolescents at this time then A lot of teenagers, they may be deficient, they may be struggling anyway, but their commitments increase. So they do more sporting activity, especially if they are a talented sports person, and their training will be increased. And they start partying, and they start sleeping less, and all the rest of it. And this child also may have a poor appetite as well. It's right and normal for adolescents to eat a whole lot more, and if they don't, it's a sign of an imbalance in their chi. And again, this child may not be showing any inclination to be a grumpy, rebellious teenager, and that's always a bad sign. So they haven't got the chi to do it. And so when you start treating them, they may start in time to be a bit more of a normal teenager, which the parent doesn't initially thank you for, but you can explain that it's a necessary part of the process.
And we can do that in childhood.
Yes. Yeah, I do actually. Yeah. I'm very mindful that, and I'm going to talk a bit more about this later, one of the differences of treating a teenager is that you have the parent in the room, and so there are two people that you have to get rapport with. But I'm very mindful of the fact that it is the teenager who is my patient. So the parent's bringing them and paying for the treatment, and they need to feel good about you as the practitioner, but they're not your patient. So just kind of keeping that in your mind helps you to make decisions about what to say to who and all the rest of it. So you need to find out which organs are the most deficient, which are really struggling, and ensure that the fire of the gate of life is burning strongly. So I often go for kind of big nourishing points like do 4 with moxa, ren 4, as well as points related to the particular organs. So this child needs more rest and downtime, less competitive sports. They need to start eating well, which they often do when they start having treatment, or at least they start eating more. And they may also need a little bit of encouragement towards independence. So I treated a girl who was 15 years old, and her mum had told me before she brought her that she was 15, and when she walked through the door, I honestly thought that she was probably about 11. She didn't look physically like a 15-year-old. And she had been swimming for her county team from a very young age. And I think largely because of that and having a relatively poor constitution, she just was not having this surge of yang that she should have been having at adolescence. She hadn't started menstruating yet either. But she came because she was feeling very depressed, and she talked about feeling more and more isolated and different from her peers, which she was, because they were all going through these changes that she didn't have the kind of chi to go through. And it was interesting because when she was on the couch, she always wanted me to put lots of blankets over her, and she would wrap up as if she were a baby. And I felt that she used to kind of regress when she was in the treatment room, which teenagers commonly do, and parents say things like, gosh, I don't know where that came from. They haven't kind of seen their teenagers acting like they sometimes do in the treatment room for many years. But being able to regress and kind of go back then helps the teenager to make the leap forwards. So sometimes that's an important part of the treatment, to just kind of allow that regression in the treatment room in whatever form it takes. So with this girl, I use lots of moxa. I gave her very, very strong treatments, and it felt like each time she came I was kind of refueling her, and eventually she was refueled to the level where she could kind of fly off and didn't have to keep coming back for top-ups. So those are the 3 key pathologies that I find are the most common in teenagers, but obviously you may find different things and you need to diagnose everyone individually. I just am going to briefly look at the 5-element perspective of anxiety and depression before talking more about practicalities at the end. So I don't know if any of you have ever seen the film Inside Out. Yeah, some of you have. So it's not often that I kind of rave about a Disney Pixar film, but it's an amazing film. And I often tell my teenagers who come to go and see it if they haven't seen it. The main character, Riley, is depressed, and she can't get back to a place of happiness because she avoids her feelings of sadness and anger. So it's a wonderful illustration of the importance of allowing all 5 emotions, and that if we try and block one, then we won't be able to achieve any of the others, as it were. So I recommend the film. It's I'm sure they must have had an acupuncture consultant when they were making the film. There are many parallels to the 5-element system. So, the kind of wood element depression that we see may be a child who, as I mentioned earlier, feels like there's no point, everything's hopeless, what's the point in trying, can't be bothered, that kind of feeling. It may be a child who's lost their sense of direction and vision. Alternatively, it may be a child who is constantly furious and raging and stuck in the emotion of anger. And passive-aggressive behaviour is quite common in teenagers, particularly when they have an imbalance in wood. So purposely taking as long as they possibly can to get ready to leave the house in the morning and to come to the table at meal times and that kind of thing. Any of that passive-aggressive behaviour might point towards a wood imbalance. And moodiness, some moodiness is absolutely par for the course for adolescence, but too much of it is not a good thing. And then if the stagnation leads to heat in the liver, there may be anxiety too. And the anxiety may be about everything that they have to get done. And they may kind of wake up at 1 a.m. going through their to-do list and anxious about kind of meeting all their goals and everything else. And these etiologies we have talked about before. If there's a lot of conflict in the home, alternatively, if no one in the family ever gets angry with anyone and it's all suppressed, then that can partly just through modelling lead to an imbalance in the wood element.
Rebecca, sorry, are you saying, when you're talking about imbalance in the wood element, you're not necessarily saying that's SCF, or you are?
I'm I'm not necessarily saying that, partly because I'm aware that not everyone here is a CF practitioner, but it could be, but it could just be an imbalance. Yeah. So these children may well be the ones that when they first come sit there thinking, why has my mother or father brought me to this weird place where they do this weird medicine? and frankly seem kind of fed up with even being there. And that's a situation where just get them on the couch, get the needles in, and get their chi flowing, and then they'll start talking. Very often, the teenagers who won't talk at the beginning, they talk at the end of the treatment or once the needles have been in for a while.
You shout out examples.
Okay. Liver 14 I use a lot. Gate of Hope, and Liver 13, Chapter Gate. So a young person with an imbalance in their fire element is very likely to be anxious. The heart needs a state of serenity for the Shen to want to go back home. And if there's no serenity, the Shen will be out there wandering around, not where they're supposed to be. This child may have a distinct lack of joy or sadness, and they may say things like, I used to love being with my friends, or I used to love riding my horse, but now actually it doesn't do anything for me anymore. Nothing really kind of raises their joy. They may be struggling in some way in their relationships with others. So they may hide themselves away because they feel too vulnerable to relate to others. Conversely, as I mentioned earlier, they might need constant contact because that's the only way that they can feel good about themselves. And there is a feeling about this child that they're not living through their heart and soul. So the Shen give us our uniqueness, and adolescence is a time to begin to find how our uniqueness is going to kind of manifest in the world and who we really want to be rather than what our parents have kind of said we need to be. And so we may get the sense with this child that they're just not on a path that's quite right for them, as it were. They're not expressing their uniqueness very strongly. So in Philip Pullman's books, the Northern Light trilogies, he has the concept of the demon, and that makes me think of the Shen. So if someone gets too far away from their demon in his books, they die. And up until teenage years, the demon of the child, which is always expressed as an animal, can change its nature. And then from teenage years onwards, the demon becomes fixed. And I think that has resonances with the fire element and really kind of finding out, who your demon is, as it were, and it becoming more fixed. And many teenagers feel very unloved and rejected, partly because their behaviour makes them a bit harder to love than they have been up until that point in their life. So it can be challenging for a parent to keep expressing their love when their teenager is being absolutely vile to them. But even if they are being vile, it doesn't mean that they don't need to feel loved anymore. And that's another purpose that we as practitioners can serve in the treatment room. We can relate to the teenager, to their good sides, and remind the parent who's sitting there that their child is a lovable, wonderful human being after all, and they might not have seen that for a while.
Points.
Oh, points. I have a longer version of this with points in. I can send it to you. Is that an easier? So if the earth element is out of balance, then worry is often a key feature, and overthinking. So this child, often before bedtime, which is the time when the chi of the stomach and spleen is at its lowest, may start to get into worry about a certain issue, and there's nothing that anyone can say to get them out of it. And actually the best thing to do is just to tell them to go to sleep and stop talking about it. But because the yi is stuck and going round and round and round about a test they have to do the next day or whatever it may be. They may be struggling to separate from the mother, because the earth element represents the mother and their earth element isn't strong. They may have a lack of stability internally, so they feel internally a bit like they're on a seesaw, and they're very easily kind of sent to one end or the other and rarely in the middle. So these points on along the middle, so Ren 8, stomach 25 and spleen 15, are wonderful points for creating more internal balance so that the child isn't so easily wobbled by external events. They may also feel an enormous amount of self-pity, that no one has it quite as hard as them. Everyone else has an iPhone 8 or whatever. Everyone else is allowed to go to this party. Everyone else, they feel very hard done by. Because they're not able to absorb what they are given. So they feel that there's a lack. And obviously eating disorders, which are hugely complex, always have an imbalance in earth somewhere in the mix. And I've put their lack of a tribe, because it's really important to adolescents for children to find a tribe of people that they identify with outside of the family. And they need to feel that they're surrounded by others. So where the earth element is depicted in the center of the 5 elements, the child needs to be at the center of things with his or her tribe around them. And so if for whatever reason friendships aren't going well, then that can be an issue. So a child with an imbalance in the metal element may be very melancholic, very sad, and they may be emotionally very fragile. So we know that the Wei Qi goes to the surface of the body and provides a protection between us and the world. And if the metal element is weak, then it's as if the child's kind of walking around without any clothes on, as it were. That's how they feel. They feel very, very vulnerable, particularly to criticism. And they may have very strong self-critical voices inside them. They may also feel uninspired by anything. So it's really important for these children to try and bring back into their lives what does inspire them. And they may also be especially disconnected from their body. So to some degree, many teenagers really don't know what's going on with their bodies. Again, I don't like to make generalizations, but I think particularly male teenagers. But if the metal element is weak and the Po is not properly housed, then there can be even more of a disconnection. So this means that it's hard for them to do what helps them. So I'm treating a boy at the moment who gets quite angry and actually violent when he hasn't eaten. And he's got lots of different pathologies, but he has absolutely no idea that he's hungry. He cannot make that connection between, oh, I'm beginning to feel angry, I need to eat. And touch is so important for the metal element. So again, it can be hard for parents to find a way of still having a tactile relationship with their teenagers, because the teenagers often don't want it. But often they do want it, but just not when anyone else is around, and only at their time of choosing, as it were. But touch can help to reinvigorate the metal element. And the water element, so the water element is inherently strained at adolescence because the kidneys drive so much of the changes that are going on. But as you all know, if kidney yin particularly is deficient, then it very often leads to anxiety. And this kind of anxiety can manifest as the child never being able to stop, never being able to rest. They drive themselves all the time to do more and more and more. But they never quite feel relaxed enough to stop and have breaks. Alternatively, they may go the other way if they're more yang shu and be really apathetic and depressed and never want to leave the house. And again, recklessness is a part of being an adolescent. Remember, they're driving a Porsche and they've been used to driving an old Robin Reliant. But the more imbalanced the water element is, the more recklessness there may be, because the je, the spirit of water, helps us to make wise decisions to keep ourselves safe. And many adolescents with a water imbalance are just exhausted, and they walk into your clinic and they have dark circles under their eyes, partly because they are always driving, pushing themselves. It's like the duck paddling under the water. You might look smooth on top of the water, but under there's an enormous amount of work going on all the time. And they're often hyper alert, they can't settle, they can't relax, and they push their body beyond its natural limits. So we are going to talk briefly about point categories now. So this is just one of many ways to think about points. So if the adolescent is depressed and not connecting with the chi of the heavens, then it makes sense to include points in your point combination, which are on the head and the face and the neck. And these will help the child to reconnect with the heavens and to feel re-inspired. And points on the face near the sense organs also, I think, help to bring more self-awareness to the teenager, because we communicate via our senses. And you find parents saying somewhere into treatment, regardless of whatever's going on with the anxiety and depression, that they often feel that their teenagers made a big leap in development. They're looking after themselves better. They're more self-aware in some way. If the young person is struggling predominantly in his or her relations with other people, then using points on the chest, the upper arms, level with the organs of the fire and metal element, and the upper back can be really useful. So the kidney chest points, the outer back shoe points on the upper back, for example. And if anxiety is the big problem and all the chi is up here and the child isn't rooted to the earth, as well as using points on the head to send the chi downwards, it's important to use points on the lower burner and the legs to root, to grasp the chi, to keep it held down. Particular favourites of mine are stomach 30, Ren 4 and Ren 6, bladder 52, kidney 1, if they can handle it. And these are categories of points that I use day in, day out when I'm treating teenagers who are anxious and depressed. So kidney chest points, out of back shoe points, the window of heaven or the window of the sky points, and also gallbladder points on the head. So if you think about, I think almost half of the points on the gallbladder channel are on the head. The gallbladder channel has an enormous effect on the brain. And after all, these young people are a lot of what's going on is driven by the changes in the brain. So I find those very powerful points to use on them. Just very briefly, some other pathologies to look out for that often come up. So there's often heat, especially in the case of anxiety, which is agitating the Shen, phlegm, which is misting the mind or harassing the Shen. There are many changes going on in the Chong Mai at adolescence, and this can lead to Qi rebelling upwards in the Chong Mai and then agitating the heart. For those of you who are familiar, the internal and the external dragons, I find many teenagers are possessed. I find myself doing the internal dragons on a higher percentage of teenage patients than on anyone else. And I think it's partly because their chi is so open that they're absorbing so much from their environment. I rarely find a husband-wife imbalance on a teenager, but I have done, and I have several times, mainly in, I can think of one case of a girl with a very serious eating disorder, and husband-wife often reflects a very, very deep conflict in the person. And in this girl, I really felt that her conflict was, do I want to carry on living or do I not? She was slowly killing herself. And doing husband-wife didn't obviously fix everything overnight, but it did seem to help her to turn the corner in her treatment of her eating disorder. And another child I found it on was really struggling with their sexuality, wondering whether it was a young man, wondering whether he was gay or not, and he wasn't only wondering about it, he was deeply anxious and upset about it, and that had caused a husband-wife imbalance. And also look out for entry-exit blocks. So I want to finish in 5 minutes, race through some practicalities. So you have to make the treatment enjoyable, because if the teenager moans to mum and dad about, oh, do I have to go for acupuncture, then most likely the parent's going to just say, this is not a battle I'm going to fight. Oh, no, okay, you don't have to go anymore. So just be authentic with them. Don't try and be one of them, but just be yourself. And don't put them under any pressure to reveal anything that's going on that they don't want to reveal, and make it light-hearted. And obviously everyone needs something slightly different. When a teenager first comes in, my first question is nearly always something like, tell me a bit about yourself. Tell me what your interests are. Start off by tapping in to something that's positive, rather than saying, I hear you've been feeling anxious and depressed. Tell me about it. Teenagers generally need a lower dose of treatment. So for me, that means using few points, few needles, and I use fine needles. I use finer needles on teenagers than I do on adults. So I normally use 0.16, the red Syrin needles. And I don't, because the chi is open, because everything's in so much flux, I don't find that you have to kind of really go for it and manipulate the chi really strongly until you have a very intense de chi sensation. You just have to make contact with the chi, and that's normally enough. If you can have alternatives to needles, then great. I have a laser machine because I treat a lot of younger children too, but they're expensive, so they're not for everyone. Even ear seeds, anything else you can do, it might be using your hands in some way, is useful. And just tell your patients and tell people you meet that acupuncture is an amazingly effective treatment for teenagers who are struggling, because often people just don't make the connection that we can help, and we can. So finally, focus on the young person's potential rather than their problems. So do that by getting them to talk about what they want to talk about, what fires them up. I think every teenager, however depressed they are, somewhere in there has a spark, something that sparks them up. You may have to search for it, but it's always there. And you have to really strive to be compassionate sometimes when you're working with teenagers. Most of the time they're great. Some of the time they can drive you mad. But the more compassion we show, the more effective our treatment will be. I've said that many times already. And yes, I've alluded to this before, but don't go in there on the first treatment telling them to make all sorts of changes to their lifestyle. Wait till you have rapport, and only tell them they need to change what is really in your mind making them poorly. And as a practitioner, I want you to know that you can really, really help. So trust in the fact that acupuncture is a brilliant treatment for teenagers who are depressed or anxious. And in knowing that, you will have greater success when working with them. So, I'm going to stop there. Any final questions?
What laser machine do you have?
I have a 3B laser pen. Yes.
Is there any variation to how you approach it if they have a chronic illness or something like that? Does it affect how you treat, or?
It probably would affect it, yes. I don't think I can say exactly in what way. It would depend very much. But yes, I would obviously take that into account, yes.
How easy is it to diagnose a CF? And if so, do you tend to go down that route and do the other support stuff with pathologies and stuff?
I think it's...
And how important is it to kind of do that?
I would say try and do it.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't do it, don't worry. Rely heavily on colour and sound. Emotion might come a bit later.
Yeah, okay, great.
But you can, and it's really useful, but if you can't, then don't worry, there's something else you can do.
Do parents stay in the treatment room by law?
Yes, by law they have to, up to the age of 16. So it can be a problem, but I try and use it to my advantage. So sometimes you see the teenager is being very kind of polite to you and saying all the right things, and then when you're looking down, you look up and you see them kind of giving a death stare to their parents, and it tells you that actually they're furious, for example. So I try and use it to my advantage.
Do the parents have to be in the room with you even when they're doing their subjective and talking
Yes,
to you?
they
So
do.
have to, the parents hear everything?
Yes.
Right.
But again, you don't need to delve into everything, so it's okay.
Do you have to insist if the parents say, no, I'm happy to go and leave?
Yes, you should insist.
You should insist.
Yes, yes. Yeah, rightly or wrongly, it's the way it is. Yes.
I have a question about IDs. Can you hear me?
Just.
Is it often the case? Could it be the case that you need to repeat IDs after a few treatments?
Yes.
Yeah.
I
So new things that come up and you can see that it's there again.
Yes, I think.
How often would it be okay to do that?
I think if I found myself doing it very regularly, I would have to sort of ask what else is going on. But, and normally I don't repeat it, but quite often I find myself repeating it, but, you know, probably with a space of months in between.
Or really not weeks?
Well, very occasionally.
Okay.
Very occasionally weeks.
Thank you.
Let's talk about using REN points. Is there sort of an age where you think, oh no, that's too young to start on REN? Or do you?
No. I use REM points on
Young
1-year-old babies.
Oh, do you?
Yeah. I forgot to say, I'm going to shamelessly plug my book, which is for sale downstairs at the Singing Dragon stall, and I'm going to be there signing copies straight after this. And it does include a whole chapter on teenage anxiety and depression, and a chapter on self-harm, and a chapter on eating disorders, for those of you who are interested. Yes?
You said that you give us a link to a longer version of this?
Yeah, I would have to send that. So if anyone that wants it comes and gives me their email address.
Thank you. I wonder if you feel there's a place for matching behaviour.
Yes.
In gaining rapport and
Yes.
advice, or as I said to parents, sometimes when they can't touch,
I think that's a really good thing to do. Yes, definitely. And it's often useful to have a conversation with the parent. You know, they may want to tell you things by email, or you can tell them, give them suggestions like that if it's something you want to do.
Very comprehensive book.
Okay, thank you very much.